Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the British Martini-Henry Mark III, a long arm for the budget-conscious empire. Strangely, this really isn't the star of today's episode, but before I explain all of that, Lightbox. These numbers should seem familiar to those who have seen previous episodes. 49.5 inches long, weight at 8.8 pounds, so just a bit chubbier. We have a magazine capacity of 0 because this is a single loader, which means we fit one cartridge at a time into the chamber, that of course being the 450 Martini. For those of you who deeply enjoy our work, please consider logging into your favorite firearm or history-oriented forum and just going bananas arguing about some minor detail of the show. The links are good for our presence and will hopefully bait in some new viewers. Or you could just support us directly on Utreon or Patreon. For the support for this episode has also come from Ballistol. I know you guys thought it might be something. This has a dog hair on it. I use this. The Universal Firearm Maintenance Oil. Wipe it on, wipe it off, and rest easy knowing that your collectibles are safe and sound. Now, last time I left you on a mini history cliffhanger. We explained that Clever had formulated Ballistol to protect metal, wood, and leather for the German army. However, it has one more hidden ability. Ballistol was based off of what is known as a medical white oil, a highly refined, non-reactive, high-purity mineral oil, which is completely safe for use in cosmetics and medical products. Moreover, Ballistol's formulation made it a mild disinfectant. In other words, at the time, it is what we would know as a wound care oil. What more could a soldier ask for? Well, he'd probably want a rifle full of Ballistol, like the one I have here today. Alright, as is tradition, this episode is one of now 4, although there will be more, covering the history and development of the Martini-Henry rifle. We started with the invention of Friedrich Martini, a single-shot breech-loading rifle which was paired with fancy rifling from Alexander Henry. From there, the rifle was trialed and tinkered into the Mark I pattern, which was so awful that it actually underwent 3 modifications. And around version number 2, the Ottomans decided to adopt it, which we talked about. By version 3, it was still, frankly, dangerous to the user and his friends especially, so they made the Mark II, which we covered last time. When entirely made of Mark II parts, this was actually a good rifle worthy of worldwide service. However, as we saw, Mark I parts often still lingered in converted rifles and caused some issues. However, that was a matter to be discovered some years later in combat. On the manufacturing side at least, nearly all of the big bugs had been squished much earlier on. Now, while all that was happening, there was this one unresolved question from all the way back to the adoption of that very first Mark I rifle. What are we going to do for a carbine? And before you think I'm pulling a switcheroo, yes, the story of the Mark III long rifle starts with the development of a carbine. At the adoption of the Martini-Henry rifle, the kingdom was still working with the still fairly newish Snider carbines in cavalry and artillery configurations. Starting as a muzzle-loading conversion, this chambered a big, slow, and fairly short-ranged 5.77 cartridge. Mixed ammunition types were a concern for logistics, especially if there were a war on, like, say, every other week in the Victorian era. However, the Snider was light, mild on recoil, and extremely handy, making it very popular in the services. The Martini carbine question got rolling in earnest back in February of 1871, when the Special Committee on Small Arms requested to shorten one of the existing short-action trials rifles for testing by the cavalry. Recall, this was right about the time when the shortened bottlenecked cartridge was chosen over the original straight wall danger pencil. 2 carbines were assembled. These were constructed to the same length and general configuration as the then in service cavalry and artillery Sniders, though the artillery model was given a thicker barrel in order to accept the Snider RIC style bayonet. These carbines were made using trials rifles, so they would have to change for final production anyway. By March of 1872, things were on better footing, and 2 more carbines could be worked up. These were ready for review in December. By January of 1873, the Duke of Cambridge formally approved both, and then he recanted that in February. The problem was that the Snider was just better balanced and handier than the Martini action carbines. The question even came up as to whether or not the Snider could just be converted to the 450 cartridge. A third attempt at the cavalry pattern was submitted in May of 1873. The grip was thin, the barrel tapered, the cleaning rod was stored in the butt, and the trigger guard and butt plate were made of brass. All of these were done to hopefully improve the balance of the gun. This made it expensive, but it did seem to at least improve matters until they went ahead and fired it. Recoil was dramatically worse, enough so that there was little interest in fielding such a carbine. Moreover, the lighter tapered barrel heated up rapidly, making it harder to shoot and move. It was becoming clear that the carbine would need a dedicated cartridge, so they reduced the powder charge and bullet weight fairly significantly in both cases. Recoil improved markedly. Precision out to 500 was found to be good, but declined sharply beyond. It was felt that the reduced 450 didn't offer any real advantage over the extant 5.77 cartridge. Given there were other concerns now going on with the rifle development, the carbine matter just sort of puttered along. Reminder, this was about the time of the changeover to the Todd trigger due to inertial release of the previous model. And the manual safety also came into doubt. It would be dropped from further carbine trials. In May of 1874, 6 more trials carbines were ordered, 3 based off the Mark I body and 3 of a special design. They were ready for testing in July and went out for trial and did fairly well. However, the trigger pull was found to be too heavy, which had actually been a long-standing complaint with the Martini. Also, the stocks were felt to be too short. Plus, there were still debates around the cartridge. Ultimately, a plan did not emerge, so in 1875, another 50 carbines were made. These now sported full-length cleaning rods and unique stock arrangements. These were trialed in May. Now, around this same time, experiments with the Mark IV rifle cartridge were abandoned. This was a slightly reduced charge, slightly reduced bullet configuration meant to clean up accuracy from your average infantryman anticipating the fierce recoil of the full-length rifle. Nearly 3 million of these were produced and then promptly abandoned. Government spending, y'all. In a bid to use what they had, the Mark IVs were broken up to be reused as blanks. The surplus of 410 grain bullets, however, led to something else. They were paired with the 70 grains of powder from the earlier carbine experiments, and actually proved to be quite successful, now accurate out to 1,000 yards, finally significantly exceeding the Snyder's capability. Problems with inconsistent burn rate resulted in using some filler material, specifically a wool tampon, which evened things out nicely. The resulting cartridge would later be sealed as the 450 carbine Mark I. Recoil was now acceptable, though there were some issues with undersighting, and there was criticism of the front sight being too coarse. As always, the trigger was not good enough. With the manual safety removed, there was some concern for a replacement option, as cavalry tended to carry the carbine with a round chambered. The Snyder had a half-cocked position after all. As we covered last time, the faults in the Mark I rifle would result in the creation of the Mark II, which was already in production some long months before it was sealed. Despite minor concerns about various fittings, the lockwork and receiver were done. So in January of 1876, another conference was held on the carbine question. 500 were ordered with the new Mark II action. These boasted a lightened barrel, the front sight was made finer but protected by a set of wings. They were fully stocked, and the forend, by the way, was not retained by that crosspin fitted through a key on the barrel. Instead, a steel plate was fitted to the bottom of the forestock, which hooked into a slot in the receiver. This was strong, simple, inexpensive, and less likely to get out of order. The receiver itself was rounded off at the front, and the nose cap and cleaning rod shaped carefully to allow for easier holstering and unholstering on horseback. The cocking indicator was shrunk, still visible, but taking up a lot less room and making for less drag. Finally, take note of that external thumb lever, which was attached directly to the tumbler, which in turn now had a half cock notch so that it could be lowered into a safe position. Like previous batches, these went out for trials with the Hussars, and some were sent along to the Royal Artillery. The new carbine finally met with overwhelming praise, except the thumb cocker thingy, which snagged on everything and was felt to be dangerous. But the rest of it was wow. Just a couple little changes here and there, and it's good to go. And it was felt, at least at first, that this would work out for both cavalry and artillery. All of them could just use a sword instead of a bayonet. Now again, at about this same time, there was a bit of a problem still nagging around the service rifles. It had to do with the strikers. The firing pins were breaking even after the introduction of snap caps. Eventually, the problem was found. The collar of the striker had too much play set inside the breech block channel. This allowed the flange of the striker to impact inside the breech block before the primer was truly struck. After slight modification, this problem was rectified. This change was paired with a new Mark III breech block, which was just slightly wider to eliminate play in the action, and with a slight opening of the firing pin hole. Both components were interchangeable with previous rifles, so they could be upgraded as needed. You can spot a Mark III breech block by the numeral 3 under the War Department initials. All of these were included when, finally, in September of 1877, this guy could be deemed arms, interchangeable, carbine, breech loading, rifled, with cleaning rod, Martini-Henry Mark I. I think we're going to squeeze it in light box. With an overall length of 37 3/4 of an inch and weighing in at 7 1/4 pounds, this is much handier than the previous long rifle. Of course, it is a single shot 450 Martini, albeit carbine cartridge. You could stick the big boy in there, but you might regret it. And I suppose with all that lead up, we really can just go straight into taking a look at this little carbine. This little guy fits on my table a lot easier, but it's still a Martini-Henry, so smooth, solid butt plate, one separate piece of wood for our butt stock, lever-operated tilting block single shot. This should be very familiar. At the front, we have, of course, a separate piece forend with no additional handguard, although this is where the changes start to occur. Just ahead of the trigger guard, the forestock is actually being held on instead of the old way with a cross pin just going through plus a key that was fitted to the barrel rather expensively. Instead, we just inletted the wood for, well, a strip of steel with a hook on it. The hook is not visible at the moment. It's under the receiver, or rather set into the receiver holding the stock there. And of course the 2 screws through it. This is faster and easier to do than all that complicated cross pin that frankly can get worked loose anyway. Unlike the rifle, the carbine has a lot going on at the front. We have this forward barrel band with no bayonet lug, but we do have, look at this underneath, this complicated assembly, this sort of Uber nose cap, which is doing a couple things at once. It's giving a lot of reinforcement, and it's retaining our cleaning/clearing rod, which is of a different design from before. Again, you just pull away and then pull out to remove it from the firearm. And as you can see, we have a totally different design. We have a full conical shape here in order to retain, and also probably to act a bit like a jag, and there's no hole through this assembly in order to fit a patch. At the front, we also don't have any concavity. Nice and solid. That's because this is sort of rounded off and meant to prevent this rod from ever snagging when being holstered, as in a saddle holster. Understandably, this presents some risk to the firing pin that they avoided on the rifle, but I suspect the risk to the holster was greater and you could just train around the firing pin issue. Returning the rod is just like the rifle. This threaded bit is for a jag, not for putting it into the gun. And we'll just feed this in until clicks into place, held nice and firm. We're doing all right. While we're up here, look at this front sight. It has a set of protective wings because they decided to make it a little finer in construction. And just so you can see it, we have a quarter moon blade set right down in there. That is much nicer than the rifle. The rear sight is not just smaller and shorter range than the rifle. There's actually another little change in here too, but let's start with the obvious. The sight base is graduated for tangential sighting of up to 300 yards, and then our slider is adjustable to 1,000, and there's a little bit of an overleaf here for beyond that range. That much, yeah, shorter than the rifle. But the big changeover is the fact that this guy is actually, and you can kind of see it at the front with this joint, and at the rear with this screw, this guy is dovetailed and screwed into place, unlike the soldered on rifle sights. That's because it was felt that it was going to be way more likely that a cavalry carbine had its rear sight knocked out of place or damaged in some way that required it to be drifted off and replaced more often than the rifle. Now the overall action and receiver, at least externally, are no different than the Mark II, except for this unique carbine cocking indicator, although it's going to catch on elsewhere as we'll see later in this episode. This guy's smaller, nice and round, less likely to cause any fuss. And I suppose we should probably talk about these markings. IC1, Interchangeable Carbine Mark I. Also new to the carbine, but not really visible from the outside, is the fact that the barrel has two flats in order to assist with aligning and fixing it to the receiver, whereas the previous Mark II and Mark I's had just one barrel flat. Now, internally, this little guy is not all that different than the Mark II rifle, at least not in a way that would be worth animating all over again, which means we can just take this little thing and put it in May's hands for a demonstration. Kaboom! Cute. Given the pent-up demand, production of this new carbine was immediately begun. Even before wide distribution, though, faults were still found with the ammunition. That wool tampon wasn't perfect and led to some loss of precision, so the interior of the case was lined with card paper instead, reducing the internal volume that way. This became the Mark II cartridge, which was introduced in January of 1878, and just because we're on the topic, issues with precision persisted. Ultimately, it was found that the paper patch wasn't adequately shredded in the shorter carbine barrels. So a pre-sliced paper patched Mark III cartridge became standard in August of 1880. Once the carbines were issued, additional problems did crop up. Most notably, the rear sight leaf was getting damaged when holstered poorly, or it was being caught up in various saddlery. The solution was approved in April of 1879, a folding leather sight cover. This required the addition of 2 screws into the forestock with which to hold it on. These started tearing up the holsters, so in July, orders were given to round off the screw heads carefully. What you're seeing now is, of course, a reproduction of the leather. Again, this is available from our friends at RLG, so give that a quick search if you need one. Now, if you're wondering why you don't see the screws on this particular carbine, well, we borrowed one that seems to have missed the upgrade, having gone out for colonial service fairly quickly. Anyway, while this would be the first Martini carbine, it wouldn't be the last. I don't have most of the others here, but we should probably run them down quickly. Next up was a model for the field and horse artillery. In December of 1877, a request for a model taking the converted P58 sword bayonet was made by the Director of Artillery. He also stated that some 20,000 would be needed no later than March of 1879. Using this as the basis, in January of 1878, the Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield forwarded a model for inspection. The result was what became the short-lived Garrison artillery carbine. Based on the IC-1, a bayonet lug was added to the front barrel band, and the nose cap was altered to permit the use of a bayonet. The clearing rod tip was also slightly modified to make room for the bayonet's crosspiece. Interestingly, no provision for a sling was provided in the sealed pattern. While the Garrison carbine did enter production, it only lasted about 3 months, as it was not issued. Instead, further questions would result in changes to the artillery carbine design as a whole. In January of 1879, it was modified to include sling swivels and underwent further testing. This resulted in changing the barrel bands, rounding the bayonet lug, and modifying the nose cap to better retain the upper band. So, in July of 1879, we get Carbine Interchangeable Mark I artillery. No more mention of Garrison. Nearly every single one of the previous Garrison carbines would be converted to this pattern. Despite starting with the intention of further recycling bayonets, the artillery carbine was soon outfitted with its own unique solution. Something of a short sword unto itself, this 25 3/4 inch long blade also sported a sawback for added utility. It was adopted in November of 1879. Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield would produce over 130,000 carbines of both patterns from 1878 into 1889. While government production stopped with the introduction of the later 303 models, colonial requests meant that commercial production by Henry Rifle Barrel and theoretically a small lot from BSA and from NAA, although neither of those actually can be confirmed, carried on. The largest order was for 28,000 IC-1s ordered by the Indian government, which also requested 1,200 artillery carbines. I won't go into detail on the service life particular to the cavalry and artillery carbines. For the most part, the battles and problems would be the same as the long rifles, except some specific bad press after the Battle of Tofrik. Here, advanced cavalry had been surprised by the modest forces, and in attempting to reconsolidate with the supporting infantry, they managed to cause a bit of momentary disorder in the square with the enemy close behind. Some blamed the Martini carbine, which for lack of a safety had to be carried chamber empty, meaning the cavalry had no time to simply stand their ground. This supposed failure of the carbine wasn't likely to have changed anything though. If there had been a safety and a round in the chamber, it really wasn't going to change the fact that the cavalry were not in a position to hold the line in that situation regardless. Alright, so we understand where the carbine came from, but what exactly does that have to do with the Mark III rifle? Well, that's actually fairly straightforward. You see, in developing the carbine, a number of time and cost-saving decisions had been made. Along the way, Ordnance applied those same changes to the rifle pattern, hence the emphasis on the term interchangeable. Not just interchangeable parts between other carbines, but interchangeable parts with the rifles. And even those things like the forestock, which can't be interchanged entirely because of the difference in length, could still be produced on the same machines as much as possible and use the same subcomponents as much as possible. The resulting pattern of long rifle was approved for service in August of 1879, and it was this guy right here, the rifle breech loading with cleaning rod Martini-Henry interchangeable Mark III. Alright, we are back to, long rifles. Coming from the Mark II, there's really not a lot of difference at the back end of the gun. Solid buttstock, flat butt plate, lever opening, same lever. We've got a single shot receiver, although I will point out, hey, that's the carbine style little cocking indicator. Neat. Trigger shroud and everything are all off the Mark II, you get the idea. As we come further forward, we're going to talk about that rear sight in just a second, but let's do samesies. Go all the way to the end. We're looking at the same general front band, same use of the Mark II style cleaning rod, fixed front sight. You guys get the idea. Let's look at what's really specific though. Borrowing from the carbine series, we of course have our steel hook into the receiver instead of the cross pin like the previous Mark II rifle. Underneath the stock line, we'll find that this also has that two-lug improved Knox form barrel for being able to fit this up at the factory. The rear sight of the Mark III has been slightly altered from the Mark II, or at least the base has. It's ever so slightly longer, more rigid, and therefore less likely to get out of order. It's also been offset by just a smidge, about a degree, in order to improve shooting beyond 600 yards, where it was found that a little deviation started to pop up. And of course internally, which we can't see here, this has the improved breech block that eliminates some of the waggle and has the striker designed to prevent firing pin breakage. Those of course could be added to Mark IIs later in service though, so it's not exclusive to the Mark III, it just came factory standard on it. Once again, mechanically, there isn't much difference here from the Mark II rifle, or of course the carbine we already covered, so we'll hand this straight off to May. At adoption, RSAF Enfield received an order for 30,000 Mark III rifles. Once again, contracts would also be let out to the commercial manufacturers. 10,000 were requested from the trade in July of 1880. It's also interesting to note that the National Arms and Ammunition Company got the short end of this stick, both in the initial order amount and the fact that their last order came in January of 1882 for just a little over 4,000 rifles. They would be forced into liquidation by the end of that year. Now, the Mark IIIs represented a lowering of the cost to produce the Martini rifle. Even so, this was a time of reduced production. Despite the obvious need for more Martinis to replace the Snider, there was still some debate going on. As far back as the adoption of the Mark I Martini-Henry, there had been some who wanted to get the entire British Army onto one rifle and cartridge right away. However, the Snider was an inexpensive conversion. Plenty were on hand, as well as a lot of 5.77 ammo. For the time being, the Army Reserve would keep with this economical option. As we saw in our Mark II episode, the lack of adoption by the reserves combined without full mobilization of the Army for war, and with that heavy production of Martini-Henry Mark IIs, well, soon the supply outran demand, so that production was halted by the then conservative government. In 1880, however, the Liberals regained control, and soon after, we see the effects of the new Secretary of State for War, Hugh Childers. The Childers reforms were far-reaching. Most notable, the regimental system was heavily reworked, going from numbers to districts. As part of this, militia battalions were attached to the regiments directly in order to form a better and larger reserve. This integration, 1-to-1, meant that it was now more important to see a standardization of equipment and ammunition between the Army proper and the reserve. Still, it was a major financial decision, and the matter was kicked along for several years. While that was all being debated, and even after it was resolved, a number of colonial governments realized that the cheaper Mark III was just the ticket for them. Orders came in from Canada, New South Wales, Victoria, and Afghanistan. By 1884, it seemed all but apparent that the Mark III for the reserves would be adopted soon, so production was ramped up, and for once, things actually went as expected. The reserves would take up the Mark III, which means more commercial contracts were let out. BSA alone took on 32,000 more, not counting additional colonial orders. Enfield production ended in 1886 thanks to yet another Martini being developed, but the commercial firms kept on well into the 1890s, still producing 450 Mark II and Mark III rifles. This would also end up adding Egypt to the list of buyers, with contracts as late as 1895. Outside of specific service with the various colonial governments, the Mark III was a rifle of the reserve, so service life wasn't all that exalted. However, it does represent a solid rifle at a discounted cost, which enabled the Empire to put itself on one cartridge, just in time for the next one to be released. Alright, with all that covered, once again I need to sort of shoehorn in a quick side note. Recall last time we discussed the cut-down Mark II rifles used to make up new artillery carbines. Well, the same would be true of the Mark III, sort of. Using the receiver's lockwork and barrels of Mark III rifles, but fitting carbine sights, the artillery carbine Mark III is a rare sight, as it was officially sealed in September of 1891, but apparently never issued. I'm unsure of how many were really made. Whew, okay, another Martini down, and just several more to go, but before all that, we will of course take a break for other content. And for right now, we need to get May's opinion on the Mark III. Alright, once more, we've made room for May.
Hello.
And we have a pair of Martinis.
That we do.
I would like to change the order.
So, well, not the carbine first and the rifle first?
Yes,
Okay.
chronologically the carbine predates by, at least in terms of development especially. But I think we should start with this because it's the most similar to what we've been doing so far.
Really? How can you tell?
Well, I have a suspicion you're not going to have a whole lot to say when we compare that to, say, like this Mark II long rifle. Any obvious differences? And I mean obvious.
Okay, well...
If you're looking that close, we're not talking obvious.
Oh, I mean, I guess it's not obvious, but the cocking indicator is a different size on the side. It's smaller.
If you really smelled around this gun, you'd probably notice the cock indicator, and you might notice the way the forend hooks in.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's got a pin right there, whereas this one doesn't have one.
Right. It's using a hook that's set into the receiver, and there's a notch cut in there.
All right.
And I will say, over time, this has become kind of loose.
Mark II does have wiggle. Mark III, no wiggle. Okay, all right.
I suspect that would last a lot longer.
So more solid then. Cool.
And then there's some differences under the stock line, like being able to have two flats on the barrel, which helps to assemble the rifle better, which I believe they were able to do the second flat because they got rid of that key. And then there's like a little tiny difference in the sight bed and little blah, 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 right? Anything else standing out whatsoever?
No, I don't think so. The problem is that I remember handling of this being the same. The weight and length are almost identical, enough that I don't think it would make a perceivable difference personally. Trigger, I think I remember being the same. Action, nothing really stands out as actually being that much different from the Mark II.
No, other than that gun just being in better shape than this one.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
But I will say, that being said, I do like that the forend is more solid on this guy, so I'd probably end up picking the Mark III over the Mark II.
Okay.
For the rifles.
Yeah, just in terms of longevity.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well,
that's
good. So I know it's a really boring comparison, but there is something valuable to be said for this, because you have a rifle that shares more parts with the carbines that are now being produced. You have a rifle that's less expensive to produce.
Oh yeah, the cocking indicator is the same size on the carbine, boy.
Yeah, it's just a smaller cocking indicator.
Okay.
So it's cheaper. It's more interchangeable.
Okay.
And yet it's stronger slightly than the service rifle, right? And then you hand it over to the reserves. It uses the same ammunition, same sights, all that good stuff.
And they're already ready for it, so that's pretty good.
That says a lot. The fact that you can get a better gun for less and give it out in such a way that it leaves your reserves absolutely trained on what they would be taking into warfare. Done, yeah. Right? 100%. That's a win. And it's kind of hard with the show because whenever you have a win, you almost don't get to talk about it as much because it went smoothly.
Right.
Like the Mark III is a great rifle. That is so boring.
It's true. We didn't have more say about things that are
complaining
terrible.
is fun.
Yeah.
All right. So with the
he's gonna tear the Grand apart. Sorry, Garand or Howard Grand. Let me say it wrong and make people mad.
No matter how you say it, it'll make them mad.
Oh yeah.
Now.
Gerund.
That would make everybody mad. Do that, yeah. We have the long rifle covered.
We have it. Yes.
Let's do the carbine because this is really what everybody's curious about. I bet.
Well, it's a carbine martini, so yeah, I'd definitely say so.
What's your first impressions being handed something like this?
Well, first impressions are it's obviously shorter.
Ow, why would you do this?
Easier for hitting Othias. Balance point. Ooh, that's better. It's right there in the center, just ahead of the receiver. I like that. Digging that. God, I just can't get over how mobile this feels. This is fantastic. And then the same, like you already pointed out, or like we pointed out, the cocking indicator is smaller than the Mark II.
Yeah, that shrank down so it would be less likely to snag in and out of a holster.
Are they really having problems with it snagging that badly?
I don't. To be honest with you, I'm not sure how much of a problem it was, except for if you think about it, if the tip is further from the axis point, you have that many more chances for it to get up high and catch stuff under it, possibly slowing the tumbler when it moves forward and therefore causing the gun to have misfires. Fair. Or because that distance, there's a chance of it bending up and just then tearing the crap out of a holster. That's so fair. I suspect by keeping the length of it down, you have less options for things to go wrong. And you're consuming less metal anyway. And nobody cared because it's still quite readable at that size. Right. Okay. And then obviously we have a different setup here up at the front. This cleaning rod setup is really rigid looking. And it's really kind of detailed. I've never seen one quite this... It's kind of pretty. Yeah, it is kind of pretty. It kind of makes me think of, what's that Norwegian Krag carbine? The 1895 is the one I'm thinking of? No, that was a half-stocked gun. It's the one that had the really ornate, like, setup up here. I can't remember which one it was. I'll have to pop a picture of it. But I really liked how detailed that one was and how focused it was for setting a bayonet on that gun. This one, for just holding the cleaning rod, this is amazing. This is a lot of detail going into it. It's really kind of settled in there. It's got a channel cut into it so that it really just kind of embeds it in there. It's kind of cool. Right.
why did they go to this length to just have it?
Because they really wanted to hold on to it.
And
they really didn't want to tear up the holsters.
God, they must have been having a time with it to go this far.
Right.
That's amazing.
Sight protectors up there too.
Yeah, we do have sight protectors for a change, which is nice. And then actually looking down the rear sight, you know what? I thought I might for a second have trouble telling the rear sight from the protectors, but you really don't, because not only are the protectors thicker, but they're also lighter shaded. Have you actually looked down that to see?
Yeah, they are. And they're also curved. So there's a lot of visuals to tell you what is the very sharp front sight versus the very blobby protectors.
Yeah, it is a triangle front sight, but it is a very sharp little top triangle there that you're trying to line into that deep set V notch. It's a little fine. It's very fine, actually.
Fine. It's good, but it is a little weird how wide that V is.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't quite match. That's unfortunate. But it's overall a very clear picture, I guess, at least.
How's the weight?
The weight's obviously improved. I mean, we've gone from the rifle length to this guy, and we have lost a lot of that weight, obviously, to the point that the balance is fantastic on this guy.
Okay. And then I guess we're down to pulling the trigger.
Yeah, I don't really remember there being that much of a difference between trigger pulls on the Mark III long rifle versus the carbine.
No, it should be the same mechanism, same everything, really.
Okay,
they're interchangeable.
Hooray, I don't remember a difference. That works out. Only real difference was the recoil, in which I expected it to be worse. I guess because in my brain I'm thinking, I'm going from a rifle version of a gun to the carbine version.
Same ammo.
That's what my brain would naturally go to, it's clearly going to have the same ammo and it's going to be a larger amount of recoil, which there was a slightly more amount of recoil, but it wasn't that bad.
We did our best to match the muzzle velocity and weight of the bullet for the carbine ammo.
Right.
So you are not seeing the rifle and carbine shooting the same cartridge.
We should have tried it, though.
We probably should have.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the gun can take it.
Yeah.
It's more about the shooter. And, of course, the sights aren't set up for that.
No.
So
it would have been an interesting thing to try, but I just remember thinking, because I was preparing for a bigger oomph, I think I tightened up a little harder than I would have normally, and I went, okay, and then I just relaxed into it and then just had a good time.
I found it to be quite significant, though.
It's still, it's not uncontrollable, but it's definitely a moderate amount of recoil.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then any other thoughts on shooting it? Like recoil, I don't know. It seemed pretty aggressive to me even with the light and load.
I do remember they're making a nice plume with that one.
Yeah.
I think one of our slow motions got such a good shot of it that it almost looks like a pom-pom is sticking out the end of the gun.
Which would you prefer between the rifle and the carbine?
I would personally end up picking the carbine simply because I'm thinking I'm going to have to be carrying it for long distances. And in general, carbines have been my preference of choice. And I think that this carbine in particular would be an excellent one to take around because of that fine sight setup.
Oh, yeah.
It'd even be able to handle longer ranges, like up to 3 and 4, without it really being a problem.
I kind of wish they put the carbine sight on the rifle.
Yeah, that would make more sense.
Yeah. This is a tricky
question
for me.
Actually?
Yeah, this is a hard one for me. The carbine's easier to carry.
Yeah.
Bayonet fighting.
Oh, that's right. We don't have a bayonet.
Is gone. Now, if you had an artillery model, you could have a bayonet, but you'd have it gets pretty weird because you could get a longer bayonet, but you're still never going to get the reach of this gun, right? Mm-hmm. And this is still an era of bayonet fighting on occasion. You're still forming squares. You're still a wall. So you definitely couldn't give all the infantrymen this carbine. It just wouldn't work.
No.
Because there's not enough, being a single shot, there's just not a high enough rate of fire to break the need to have a steel wall. Mm-hmm. These things are not firing at a rate capable of stopping cavalry from being a thing yet, right? So unless you have, and I mean machine guns, they were carrying Gatlings and things like that around. Mm-hmm. But those were very large semi-artillery pieces. They weren't applied in such a way to really halt cavalry for good. They had jam issues.
Right. There was all sorts of hang-ups with that.
This is an era in which, as much as we might laugh at it, I suspect as an infantryman, this is more critical.
Yeah. Okay, I could see that.
You need to be able to have a pike, and you need to be able to take a 1,000-yard shot, which is wild to us today. But remember, they're not taking the 1,000-yard shot as an individual. They're taking them as a group.
Right.
And we saw this in the Ottoman episode at Plevna.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians were getting outranged by harassing fire like you would use later on in World War I. They would use machine guns for that indirect fire role.
Right.
that came from just forming people up and volley firing, and it did work. Like, there are reports of it working. So
enough that the Russians were quite wary of it.
Right. Having that really heavy bullet, that higher velocity, and really being able to reach out beyond 1,000 yards, actually counts for something in that period. When we think of World War I, we think of close range fighting under 400 yards in the trenches.
So something more like this.
Right.
I understand.
And a lot of these ended up being dragged into weird roles. So you start to see these guns turning up in reports of experimentation on air-to-air warfare. So
interesting.
Yeah, Martini carbines were one of those things that they could take up in the airplane.
Okay.
They actually developed an incendiary bullet because early incendiary bullets, they weren't able to get the technology compressed down to 303 as easy as it was to stick it in a big fat 450 cartridge.
Ooh.
So if you want to do a balloon buster of some sort, then you stick one of these in a biplane with a pack of ammo that is incendiary that you can then shoot at the balloons.
Okay. I mean, it's if it works, hey man.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely.
And then this is easier to carry around. This is much more compact and easy to put on an airplane too.
Right.
So
now the numbers of those things that get made and issued are way smaller because aviation is just a fraction of the size of the army in that period. You know, you have these massive armies and these little air corps, but there are documents, there are records, there are diagrams of these incendiary 450 cartridges that would be fed through the carbines. So
now, why didn't we try that?
Actually, you know why we didn't try it?
Why?
There's a weight limit. Essentially, well, there's a limit on the amount of incendiary or explosive material you can put into a projectile legally in the U.S.
Oh,
and we couldn't quite figure out if we were on or over, and then we had to actually construct it. So it's not that we can't try to do that experiment some other time, but we were actually trying to figure out whether or not we were in like destructive device territory, which is a whole other mess. And
YouTube would love that.
Like one of these days, I mean, if anybody knows more about it, that'd be great. I would love to talk about that topic one day. And that's kind of why we didn't get into it a lot in this episode either, because I'm weighing out the chances of doing something like that maybe next year and talking about the Martini specifically in World War I.
Well, it's fine. We'll be talking about Martinis the entire year anyway, so.
Yeah, but Mark II, Mark III's, and then we're going to talk about the Mark IVs. I'm going to have to give some brief mention of their utility in the Great War, but I'm not quite sure how I'm structuring it yet because it really represents just a small little smidge at the end of their life compared to their actual service in the Victorian era. So, but it is interesting. I mean, it's there. I'm sorry, I kind of just
I was excited to hear about that. I want to try it now. And you failed me for not letting me try it so far.
All right. Well, anything else? Final comments?
I think that pretty much covers everything. I understand the perspective for situational differences, whereas there might be times in which the rifle comes in more handy, obviously having the bayonet and the longer reach, whereas the carbine might be better suited for something like World War I settings. And that's just kind of how it is. Me personally as a shooter though, I'd be taking this carbine all day.
Yeah, that thing's cute.
Oh yeah, it's adorable.
It's actually just cute.
Yeah, I like it.
I love it.
Yeah, we should just have Martini carbines. Why don't we just the Martini carbine show?
Because I don't own any. Because we borrowed this.
Oh,
we borrowed both of these.
Oh, there you go.
Which will lead us into the wrap for this episode. So, thank you once again for tuning in, and special thanks go to two individuals on today's episode. One is today's gun donor, who actually lent us both of the pieces we used today, and this is our friend Mark Mayer. We really appreciate him coming through for us and allowing us to share them with all of you.
Yes, thanks, man. We appreciate it. This was a heck of a lot of fun to try out, and to also be able to feel if there were any differences. Not really that much at all until we got to the carbine. But really cool to try, so thank you.
Yeah. He actually let me knock all the dirt off that one, too.
Oh, he let you.
There was something on that gun.
Really?
Yeah, I think I might have a photo, but it just wanted to peel like when you get Elmer's glue on your skin. But it would only do that if you got it kerosened. And then...
Where was it peeling? On the metal?
It was just an even coat over the entire metal, and I'm not sure what substance it was.
Oh, Lord.
But it had like almost like camel hair mixed into it, too.
Some sort of preservation attempt that went wrong?
I don't know, but whatever it was gumming everything up real bad. And after we got it out, the gun ran great.
All right.
So,
I mean, I enjoyed it.
Our second person to thank is our executive producer for this episode, which
Ta-da!
we introduced last episode, new process, but this is someone who met what we roughly would say is close to 10% of the cost of producing this episode on the baseline, minus any extras. We have an expensive show.
We do.
But it's been made possible by our donors, including, in this case, once again, Dave from Dublin.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
who has come forward to
From
make
Dublin.
sure that many of you can enjoy this show for absolutely free.
True.
So everybody thank Dave,
Yes.
just as we are.
Please, thank you.
All right, I think that has us covered.
I think so.
And next time is not Martini-Henry's.
What will it be?
Because
I don't know.
We're going to do 2 and 2
Okay.
running through the forest.
Oh,
Picking up the martinis and bopping you on the head.
see what he did there?
All right, I'm at the table with Lock, Stock, and Barrel. This is an auction group that you may recognize from Gunbroker, the most notorious suckers of your money that you have ever encountered. And yet, they're the only ones that bring you Grandpa's treasure, because he was going to take it to the grave. So, love him or hate him, we've got our auction guys with us. I'm with Spencer, and I have Bud. Mm-hmm. You guys have to say things, it's audio.
Yeah, sorry. we weren't sure at what point we were supposed to take over here, but we will.
No, it's very loose. This is only for our patrons,
Okay.
So it's not going to go full public unless for some reason.
It's good to have you. You do training for us. We get to hire new employees and say, go home and watch YouTube videos at night, turn on C&Rsenal. Once you've seen every video, you can work here.
How many have quit after that?
I don't want to talk about our turnover rate.
Oh, well,
But it's not because
none,
definitely,
none over that.
I mean, I don't know who's supposed to be getting plugged here, but C&Rsenal is one of the best reference resources we have. And it's just, I mean, it's invaluable. We've been so excited to meet you guys.
Well, I'll take the compliments on the behalf, because this is, like I was saying a second ago, this is going out to the people who are patrons of the show. So these are people that have kicked in $1 to $5 or so a month trying to keep us afloat, which, by the way, is almost all of our budget. So since we work on a donor model, it's kind of like having investors meetings.
Well, thank you to your patrons.
Right, because they're making it possible. So, yeah. But while I'm on this trip, I've driven out. So the way this all happened, so that you guys know from the show perspective why I'm here, we put out the call looking for 1909. And then you guys reached out from LSB and said, we know a guy. And then it turns out you didn't know a guy.
Well, we knew a guy, but that guy wasn't. That guy wasn't the guy we were hoping he was.
You knew a second guy, which was even more impressive.
Which should have been the first guy.
You almost knew a third guy, but actually I just heard back from him. He doesn't have it.
He doesn't have the 1910?
No, he has a 1910/11
The Special Army. Okay.
Which is very interesting, and I would love to cover it, but it's kind of like, I'm going to make this whole detour to Houston to get it.
Right, and it's skipping over a
Which
gun
I'm actually still waffling on, because it's like, well, the photos would be nice if I find a 10 later, but...
Who has a 10?
Supposedly the Ogden Museum does this bit of grease, and ignore that hole right there. But you can see it externally in the way that the trigger guard is set up. We have this beautiful piece of shrouding, this bit of metal here that wraps around the front of the trigger in order to keep it from ingesting more mud or sand than necessary. This will not be seen on a Mark I.